but I wanted to say welcome to tea time, such as it is. This is the slightly more fun, social section of the day, insofar as it is not a technical talk, it's more listening to some experts talk about their fields and their experiences within it, and what they think is exciting and impressive, and what they're really looking forward to in their own discipline. So we have this great range of talent. Not including me, Sarah Wise. I am a lecturer at University College London in the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. I am serving as your host, as I am the most American and loquacious of all of the organizing staff. So welcome, thank you so much to my three panelists who have agreed to be interviewed. Thank you for taking the time to do this, and welcome to all of our viewers, I suppose. I want you to know we ran through quite a range of possible titles for this event, all of which ended up ultimately being rejected, but there were some plays on Saturday Night Live. We also tried to do 8 out of 10 chats, and Have I Got Views for You, both of which are like quite obscure British panel show references, and they didn't really work out, but we just thought we'd throw all those jokes out here because we've spent a lot of time thinking about it. But if I can introduce my panelists, we're going to go alphabetically by given name. First, Denise McKenzie. She's the director of the Benchmark Initiative at Geovation UK and is joining us from there in her, which is not associated with the physical office she is in currently. That is hers. We next have Licia Capra, who is a professor of pervasive computing in the Department of Computer Science at my own University College London.
Nice to meet you, Sarah, by the way.
Yes, I feel quite certain I have actually met you in at least one, probably.
Me either.
So great to see you. And then also Monica Stevens, who was originally at the University of Buffalo and is, I believe, in the process of making the switch to Durham University. I know at least one person who's just moved to Buffalo and is quite disappointed to have discovered that you were not going to be there, Monica. So your presence will apparently be sorely missed.
I'm hopefully still here in Buffalo for a couple more months because I can't actually get a visa right now. So
right, it's a great experience. If there were a drinking session after this, I would definitely take you, and we could drink on that together.
I would love to hear more about your issues.
It's great. It's great. But in more fun topics that other people enjoy hearing about, I was hoping that I could start with a couple of sort of more formal questions. I wanted to pitch this to the three of you because you have these very different kinds of experiences. You have these very different sort of specializations where Denise is working. And again, here I'm very much paraphrasing, and I'm hoping you guys will tell me much more about your work as you understand it and as you conceptualize it. But Denise is, as I understand it, works more explicitly with a sort of geospatial side of data, so the sort of spatial bit. Whereas Licia is looking at sort of more the algorithms and the sort of data side, so how do you work with the data specifically? And then Monica is also looking a little bit more at how the sort of social networks that constrain and shape this can connect and divide people relative to space. So we're looking at, I would argue, and please correct me if I'm wrong, data from three fairly different perspectives, which is really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys talk about your domains of expertise. So I was hoping I could pose a couple formal questions to you guys, and then I'll intersperse some of the sillier questions with those as things get too serious or exciting, as a cooling off period. But initially, if I could ask each of you to go through and say, what would you say is the most exciting, the coolest thing that's come out of your field this year? And whatever order you guys want to go. I'll spontaneously say for the first one to force this, I've gone in the order that I've presented you, and I think it's maybe most fair to therefore force Denise to speak first, if you don't mind, Denise. I'm picking on you.
This is so hard at the moment for geospatial. So I've worked in this field now for 22 years. Probably not as a researcher as such, so more kind of in projects, but every bit of project work that I've done has been research type projects and innovation projects in that pathway too. I think if I was going to say one thing for me that's been really exciting, so I took on this project with Benchmark last year, and it's looking at the field of location data ethics, essentially. You know, what does responsible use of data look like? And to be fair, I think when we took this on in October, it was probably a fairly fringe conversation about what that is. And strangely enough, with having something, you know, could never have predicted suddenly we'd be in a pandemic of global proportions, where actually the use of people's location data suddenly became front and center of, you know, the front page of newspapers and important blogs and important commentators all grappling with the issues of ethics. And so I think if I look at geospatial, I think what's kind of happened, particularly in the last couple of years, is that we've moved from this field where it was just always about innovation. You know, what could we do new? What could we do better? And we're now kind of in this interesting space where people are going, well, that's great. I know you can do this, but should you do that? And so it's kind of like the brakes have been pulled just a little bit. And, you know, we can't just be techie all the time. We actually now have to look at it. That's why I'm really, really interested to hear some of the stuff that Monica is going to say in here as well, because I think it's starting to become, disciplines are no longer clear. They're no longer, the lines are no longer very, very simple between them. And we're crossing between research around social impacts, we're crossing the lines between legal, policy, and the technical at the moment. And to me, that's really exciting. So I think when you start blending all of that expertise, you really start making proper world solutions and decisions that are good. So then for me, actually having ethics recognized, I guess, as an important part of the technical discipline has been a really big leap in the last couple of years.
No, great. I mean, so Licia, how does that, you can answer this question separately. At some point, I will be really keen to hear your guys' responses to each other and thoughts from each other, but for a first pass.
Yeah, no, I started saying a little bit where I'm coming from, but then I will immediately also follow up on what Denise was mentioning. So my field is very different. So I've been trained, and all my academic career I've worked in computer science. And I would say that so I'm the techie one, I guess. And my domain at the moment, and for the last few years, has been computational social science. So I study social phenomena and human behaviors through the lens of big data, let's say, and more recently through the lens of geospatial data. So when I started working in this field a few years ago, the data we had access to was mainly interaction data. So, for example, if I had access to a mobile phone data set, I knew that there had been a phone call between user A and user B. Or if I had access to movement data, I knew that A and B had been co-located for a certain period of times, or that user A was following user B if I was using social media data and so on. So it was just point-to-point interaction. And then what has happened in the last, and so the analysis we could do was interesting, but I wouldn't say shallow, but quite superficial. And then what happened all of a sudden is that we started to have very easy access to semantically rich data. So I know what conversations people are having, and I can apply natural language processing to learn all sorts of things about people. And it can get very exciting, and it can get very intrusive. And so the topic of ethics that Denise was mentioning about, and finding the right balance, and what are the ethical questions we can ask, and the ethical analysis we can do, becomes very prominent. But basically what happened in my field, the main change is that all of a sudden we had layers and layers of semantics and information that we could use to enrich the analysis we were doing.
Great. I mean, so quite related, actually. After all, that was a
absolutely.
Monica, can I ask you to?
Yeah. So is your question, what is the coolest exciting thing to come out of the field this year, meaning 2020? Because I would say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You can pick academic or calendar year, whichever you more want to talk about at this exact moment. Follow your joy.
I mean, there's really only one thing in my mind that has come out of this year, which is COVID. And I do think that the ethics, and generally I would say the ethics, but I have to say we are compromising ethics more in what I'm seeing is that there's much more freedom of releasing medical information at a broader scale, and also releasing locational data and even like technical data of like cell phone interactions and that sort of thing. But I would say that for me, the other thing is with social distancing this year under COVID, we are seeing people using social media in sort of new ways to connect and communicate. People are using Zoom for social hours and that sort of thing. And that does give another aspect of the data that makes it a little easier to trace. But I think that the ethics question that Denise brought up is very, very important because of how we are violating that now. Or that it's not like these issues disappeared when there was suddenly a pandemic. The same issues still exist. They just seem to be discarded at a different rate.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's really interesting the degree to which, yeah, there's the big questions. Those are like just, I'm going to draw this trend. As Denise said, the combinations and the interactions between the different data sets have gotten even more interesting. The different fields coming together in interesting new ways. As Licia says, that's only layering deeper and deeper as time goes on. And then
yeah, so linking, for example, what kind of analysis could we do in relation to the pandemic? All of a sudden, I'm thinking, well, not only could we delve into behavioral differences between different countries, for example, but I could zoom in and take London. How are things working out in the east of London relative to west of London? Who is breaking the rules more than others? And you can trace what people are talking about. I mean, that was policy. Have I changed my behavior? Do I still go to shops? Have I reduced that? Am I using my 1 hour allowed in the park or not? So all of a sudden, and can I break it down by demographics, not only by geography? So the potentials for studies are ballooning all over the place. And I mean, seriously, it would be really useful when it comes to policy making and thinking in terms of prevention and what we could do, containment and so on. But they're always interfering with what is good to do and what is actually a step beyond what should be done.
Yeah. I think what I guess I'd follow up instead of one of the things that we've also found here too is that there's a really great challenge in an organisation explaining that they have done the right thing with the data as well. So that seems to be a really great challenge, because I think actually, Licia, you raised such a huge amount of things. We can do so much good and learn so much by a lot of these data combinations, but we have a really poor language set by which to communicate out to the general public so that they can feel that there's confidence and trust in what's going to happen with the data that's about them and what's going to happen with their location data. And so it's a really interesting balance I think we've got at the moment, because yes, you want everyone to be very careful and you don't want private data to be exposed and you don't want it to be misused, but I also don't want to scare the public so badly that they suddenly switch off every single thing on their phone and put a tinfoil hat on and kind of go, I don't want to interact with the world, because of course then the information about them disappears from our understanding of the world. And so there's kind of a really interesting nexus I think we've got at the moment of how do we get that balance right of sort of communicating, sharing, being really transparent in the work that we're doing, but also making sure we're not doing the wrong thing at the same time and we're not causing harm where we shouldn't be.
So I was going to ask at a later point, but I think that this fits in quite nicely now. I was curious at a high level how things had changed on the longer term. So to what degree do you feel that this is a continuation, and to what degree do you feel that there have been significant changes in the last sort of year or so? Obviously, there's been this big event, which is COVID, which has fundamentally changed the way that a lot of us are willing to share data, to allow people and organizations to use our data. So in some cases, I was more broadly interested in to what degree, what does the long-term trajectory of this look like to you? And to what extent is the last year a deviation from that?
I would say that there was a shift that happened in 2016, both with Brexit, with Cambridge Analytica, and with the US 2016 disaster. I think that there suddenly became this conversation about what is online privacy and what is the ethics of using people's data. And there had been several, especially when you're talking about social media data, there had been several kind of questions before the sort of happiness study that Facebook did with a variety of researchers about like, what is the ethics of manipulating an information stream? But those didn't seem to reach sort of the broad level of fake news being a common lexicon in US society, but also just the very, very common thing of people being suddenly realizing, oh, I am putting a lot of information out there. And this is sort of very identifiable and could follow me in different ways. There's still a massive amount of confusion about that data. And, explaining the difference between cookies and email spam or locational data, like these are all slightly different things. But despite that, there is kind of a very common understanding that there is a problem right now. And then I think that during COVID, there's been a little bit of a regression with remembering this is still a problem and that not everybody has a right to our personal information.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I can devil's advocate slightly here, not to say actually privacy is bad, but to say that, I think there's also been a lot of really interesting data, which I think treads a slightly different line. So, Denise, I'm quite sure that while I was stalking you online in preparation for this, I saw that you are quite involved with the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team also. Is that not the case?
Well, so not so much involved with the team. I've worked a lot, and Rebecca Firth and I have run, certainly from a different angle. Rebecca and I both got, a passion around diversity in the technology space. And so she and I have run some events looking at that. But no, I'm a great advocate of kind of what the HOT team do and all of the work that they do. So in previous career before this one, I was working for OGC, so the standards body. And one of the amazing things about the outreach role that I did there is that I pretty much got to work with almost everybody. So, it's kind of quite an amazing thing to be in the geospatial field and travel to all of these different countries and see all of these different organizations around the world. So yeah, HOT's one of those ones that I've done work with across the course of time.
Yeah. I mean, so I am, as everyone who has ever met me before this exact moment knows, a major OpenStreetMap fangirl. And it features hugely in my work, that kind of data and the use of that. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things where there's a lot of data that's been generated, and there's other interesting ethical questions there in some cases, like if you're mapping a refugee camp or if you're mapping an area where there's people of a particular ethnicity which are being targeted by their government, it can be quite a risky business. So I guess it's unfortunately, it's not quite as, actually, it's not a problem to map these communities, but I think it's an interesting point how that kind of data has been generated. And I guess I would say in vastly more extensive ways. So I guess I don't know to what degree that fits in with the work your organization is doing now.
So HOT's definitely an organization I'm working with as far as the ethics side of things go, because this is definitely a topic that they're looking at. I think one of the really interesting things, if you look at kind of the field of geospatial, often you have a very simple problem put in front of you. You go, right, I know which tool I'm going to use, which data I'm going to go collect, I'm going to go and do that. That's fine. What I think we've never really done in the space, and this is where you've got groups like HOT that are now kind of thinking about this, is going, actually, before we launch into this project, I know it's about this problem, but if we choose to collect this data and use this tool, could we cause some unintentional harm, or is there a consequence to something that we haven't thought of yet about what we're going to do? Are we going to combine this data with some other data? Could somebody else combine other data with this and reverse engineer it? So I think what's really interesting at the moment with a lot of these particularly big international NGOs and so forth that collect, frankly, a lot of data about people, you know, and often quite vulnerable people, is that they're really thinking, and I, you know, should totally disclose that this phrase that I'm about to use came from someone called Tom Orrell, and I thought it was just such a good way to capture the ethics space, is he talked about the need to have an inventory of harms. So to kind of be able to have a collective knowledge of the things that we already know, if you combine this sorts of data, it's going to cause this harm. Or if you use this particular tool in this way, we know that this can cause this sort of harm. And so I mean, to some respects, it's perhaps a bit of like almost risk assessment, but it's trying to get, I think, those of us that are in the technology space, that just because we have one idea about how we think our tool or our solution is going to work at the end, we're now being asked to kind of expand that range at the beginning of our projects. And I think throughout our projects too, to sort of think, when I do this next interaction, you know, when I connect with that other organization to take their data and I combine it, or I'm going to make this bit public, you know, at each point of those interactions, could I cause something? I think it's going to be good, but could I cause something that would be bad? And actually, you know, if we had this kind of inventory of harms as such, then we could always be collectively adding to it too. So once the mistake's been made, hopefully you add it to the harms register, and then no one else is going to make that mistake again. And I think this you know, feeds really well into that algorithm space and looking at biases and how those things appear. You know, if we could find a very good way of creating that registry or inventory each time we kind of discover, darn, we caused a bias and we didn't mean to, but actually you can mitigate that by doing X and add that to the harms register, well, suddenly you start creating this amazing body of knowledge where people can really, I think, have good examples about how to be responsible in what they're doing with their data at that point. And to me, I think going to the what's changed in this 12 months, you know, I think I've been excited to see the number of data collaboratives that have appeared in this space, but more the number of those that have appeared that are thinking about this. So thinking about the data that they're putting together and how it's interacting with each other. And I just don't think we've seen it quite on that scale before. So it's interesting, I think, that COVID has caused this kind of real thinking about, just because you can pull in data, you know, is it good to have it all together? Is it good to have it interacting? You know, what are we doing with it? And there's some really good collaboratives that are thinking about that sort of use and what you can do with the data they're putting together.
Licia, I think I saw you nodding along quite a few points.
Yeah, it's just, well, as it so happened, OpenStreetMap was one of the first GIS related tools I've ever explored, but I was coming from a different perspective. I was looking at crowdsourcing tools. And so from Wikipedia, then going into OpenStreetMap. And the kind of questions I was interested in were more like, so when we design tools such as, let's say, OpenStreetMap, we make this, computer scientists make decisions of the functionalities of the tools, of the user interface, and so on. And so things we were interested in were like, are we making design decisions that will mean down the line people will appropriate the technology in different ways, in ways that are unintentional, especially from the perspective of a designer that builds the systems, and that may drag some people out and they might drag some other people in, but they may also favor misbehaviors versus others. So a very simple example, if I make an edit or a contribution, deciding whether to make it anonymous, for example, or not, is a big decision, and that will have repercussions. When, for example, we create these tools, and there is the possibility for somebody to revert an action done by another, and then you start these fights, possibly, or maybe just difference of opinions. Again, these are behaviors or sometimes misbehaviors that we should be able to link back to, from a computer science perspective, to the design decisions we've made when building such a tools. And what we were interested in looking at was whether, for example, the decisions we've made with OpenStreetMap and later on with HOT had repercussions on who the demographics of people using the tools, the kind of contributions they make. So that's why I was nodding. I was like, yes. I mean, these are all big questions, and it was interesting to see how, for example, the early decisions made when building OSM tools drove in a certain community, and then the humanitarian OpenStreetMap drove in a completely different, well, a much broader and diverse community. So there's been an evolution in the kind of tools and the technologies supporting contributions. And I don't know whether there was a catalog, maybe there wasn't at that point of behaviors we didn't want, but research started to be published quite a lot in terms of, look, these areas are being underrepresented. Content from this demographic is being underrepresented. How else can we design those to encourage participation, to encourage coverage of certain topics or areas and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking of, there was an activation, a mapathon that I took part in at one point, where we had been mapping the material of the buildings. The survey that people had done on the ground included whether the building was made out of brick or whether it was made out of, I think, sort of tin. And the Médecins Sans Frontières team on the ground came back to us and said, actually, please take out all of the information about what it's made out of, because if it's made out of brick, that means that they have a permit to build their house. And if it's made out of tin, it means that they're squatting. And so the government can literally go through and say, okay, so the squatters are there, and we're going to evict them. So we literally had to go back. And, you know, I'm also from a computer science background, and I was like, why would you drop data if you, because for very good reasons is why.
Yeah.
So we were
and they're those,
mapping the footprint, but not,
Yeah, they're those things that we talk about as being the unintended consequences of the work that you're doing. And, you know, with the very best of intention, you know, you're doing something, but it's not, you know, actually when you get on the ground. And this is where I think actually diversity plays a really, really big part in what we're talking about with teams, because I think we run a risk sometimes as well when we're from a nation that is, you know, very educated with our own cultural way and political understandings of the world that we're in. And then we're participating in a mapathon or we're doing something here, but we have no context of the political, on-the-ground local environment that the people are living in, whose data it is that we're collecting information about, what impact that's going to have on them. And I think they're some of those ones that in our work we're starting to see how we're ever going to get to a point of actually kind of, you know, having a framework to help everybody find all of these things. I think it's, at the moment, what we're really trying to do is cause everyone to think about that, you know, cause people to really try and expand out and ensure that you've done your sort of local social research and understand the impacts of what it is that you're going to do. And I think that's a really good step forwards into the sort of responsible use of data. And it doesn't apply just to location data, but that's my field, so that's the one that we're looking at from an ethics perspective.
I think you asked about how this has changed over time, and I think that when in one of the questions that you wrote, when 10 years ago we were spending all of our time and energy convincing people that like OpenStreetMap was accurate, that their redundancy of contributions led to higher accuracy, that it could be just as accurate as Ordnance survey maps and gazetteers and that sort of thing. And I think that sort of shifted to like, okay, yes, it's accurate, but why is it less accurate here? Or why is it more problematic in these ways here? And I think at the same time, Google followed in the steps of OpenStreetMap. They began crowdsourcing their maps, like in 2012 or so. They started crowdsourcing that, but then they had to turn it off in 2015 because white supremacists started using Google Maps as one more way to spread white supremacy, and using the crowdsourcing ability as they changed the White House and Howard University to have the N-word, so that if you searched for the N-word, it would be tagged with the White House where Obama was president. And so it was intended as a racial slur, clearly. But when VGI became sort of supremacist, they shut it down. And so I think OpenStreetMap has been much more creative in sort of responding to the problems that exist within their community and within structurally as well, and have been actually able to receive and restructure around feedback, which has been a really impressive aspect of that community.
No, it's, I mean, so I'm going to continue. We've had a couple of really interesting points that people have made on the sidebar, and so I've realized that I've not said one of the vision for the structure of how this will go is that the panel discussion will continue till the end of the hour, but after that I've asked my great student Hannah Gumbel to go through and check some of the most interesting points and just explicitly ask you guys to kind of maybe talk on those, or if there are questions, to answer those as much as possible. So that's something that she's going to do to me. So if you have a couple of questions to the people listening, if you have watchers, one might even use the phrase, if you have a question, just bung it in the chat, and if you are lucky enough to be selected by Hannah, you might have your question answered in the final half an hour. So, because people are making some good points. Andrea it's reminding me of the OpenStreetMap history, which is that it was founded by a computer scientist at UCL, which is we are proud, Steve Coast. And he also points out that there were cases of political vandalism in OSM against specific groups, for example, in the Syrian civil war. And I'm also quite certain at least several moderators thought I was a vandal for tagging things with the wrong construction tag. And I got a very stern talking to from some Germans who were just with me. But then they've forgiven me. So yes. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the questions that people want us to hear about have to do with privacy and security, and I think that's something I'm going to ask you guys to come back to in a moment. But I also did promise that we would do some slightly more fun palette cleansers, and I feel bad for not doing that. So just as a rapid fire immediately, and I'm going to ask you guys to go backward because I keep picking on Denise and making her go first. What is your favorite game? You're allowed to say a board game, a video game, card game. If you played sort of Red Rover or any of the games where you ran into each other as a kid on the playground, that counts too. Please don't pick the board game Pandemic. Anything else is fair game. And I'm going to start with Monica because
I probably spend most of my time playing kid games with my 4-year-old, which is not that much fun. So, which I don't really enjoy the Pete the Cat button game or Count Your Chickens. Sometimes Fox's Party is nice, where you figure out which animals are bigger and smaller. Personally, I would love to play more advanced games like Settlers of Catan or Dominion, but I mostly end up playing kid games, unfortunately.
But your kid's going to be grateful later, so that's what matters. Important bonding.
Right. Right. Hide and seek. Play a lot of hide and seek.
Okay, Licia, what say you?
I've changed a lot over time. When I was up until the end of my uni years, as a student, I was really into card games, and running tournaments 2 against 2, eliminations and so on. I was very, very competitive and very bad losers as well. But for the last few years, I just like brainless games. Something where you just switch off your mind and you just have fun being silly. So if I had to pick one at the moment, I would pick Pictionary. The game when you have to draw. And my drawing skills are probably that of a 5-year-old. No insult intended to the 5-year-old kids, but I'm really, really bad. But it's just I find it so liberating. Another one I really love as well, is Twister. The physics. And actually, that one I'm really good. And all those years of yoga, I'm really playing off in those. So something physical, nothing brainy, nothing brainy.
Brilliant.
Okay, I've liked all these answers so far. Denise, what game?
Yeah, I know. Well, a bit like Monica, I'm a bit of a Settlers of Catan fan in this house as well. But I think also probably my all-time favorite though is Exploding Kittens,
Yes.
which is a great game for taking on travel with. I've got kids as well. Mine are a bit older, so I've got a 10 and 13, well, 11 now and 13-year-old. So they love Exploding Kittens. But I think the brain training one, I'm totally with you on that. And I have been a Tetris addict when it comes to computer gaming since I was very young. And it's like the go-to computer game that I can just play when you've had that sort of day and your brain is just full with all of the detail. And I'm like, I can just focus on that and move my little blocks around. And so, yeah, Tetris would be absolutely one of my all-time favorites.
Okay, again, all of these are charming answers. Like, I also enjoy Exploding Kittens, I should clarify. So if anyone among the audience likes the game Terraforming Mars, I think my boyfriend is tired of playing it with me, so we could, it's a board game and there's a lot of bits, but it's really, really fun. So, my email is probably associated with this somewhere, so just let me know. So, okay, all right, so thank you guys for humoring me with a sillier question. I'm now going to force you guys back into the hard stuff. And I was, one of the things I wanted to ask, another sort of like really high level question is, what is the biggest question outstanding in your field, which I gave you, I think I said in the original email that I sent you, the equivalent of Fermat's last theorem. So something that is the big question. And if you had a PhD student come to you and say, oh, I'm working on this and intend to complete it by the end of my PhD, and you would say, oh, no, that's the big open question that no one has solved. What would be, in your mind, the thing that you would most want to do? And I've made everyone else go first, so Licia, I might pick on you this time, if that's okay.
Absolutely, that's fine.
Okay.
Absolutely. Not an easy question, by the way.
No, I'm sorry. These are all very general and very hard, and I'm very much like I'm.
No. That's fine. I'll just tell you something that is at the top of my head, and maybe it's not the answer you're looking for, but anyway, it's very close to my heart. Yeah. So, as a computational social scientist, when we study human behaviors, basically we do it through the footprints that users leave behind. Okay, we really have no control most of the time on the way this data has been generated. So whenever we do a cool piece of research and we've had some findings and we share it with the research community and beyond, we are always being pointed and said, oh, but you cannot claim causality. Right? You do these observations, you can relate A to B, you can put in all sorts of controls you can, but you can never control for everything. And in the back of my head is, well, I'm trying the best I can, but I can't create an A/B, a controlled experiment. I don't have the luxury, and this is core to the whole field. And yet, in recent years, I've started to see maybe the first few baby steps on how to create methodologies for quasi-experiments, in a sense, where you can kind of get close to estimating causality without having the luxury of, having the A/B splits. So I think that if we could push research into methods in this direction, that would really make us achieve a step change that would bring us closer to making, being able to make claims related to causality and not just connections between variables in a sense. So yeah, it would be unfair maybe on a PhD student to say your PhD is not going to develop methods that will, but I've seen very interesting works coming out that are going that direction. So hopefully there will be the possibility of closing the gaps there.
Yeah, no, great. Either Monica or Denise, whichever of you.
I'll go because I'm probably going to say something kind of similar to Denise. I think that to me, the big overarching question that really we need to address is how can we prevent the harm to communities caused by social media and caused by the shift towards digital and mobile applications? How can we save communities, not even save them? How can we provide sort of a resilience and that sort of thing to communities to prevent these sort of major problems that are happening right now?
Yeah, no, I'll echo Monica there. I think I had a couple of things that popped up in my head. I think this issue of harms is getting bigger and bigger by the second, simply by the sheer volume of data that is now being generated throughout the world. And the reality is, you talk to any organization, and pretty much all of them go, I now have more data than I know what to do with, and this is becoming a problem. And actually, when you've got that problem, that causes, things to be missed, mistakes to be made, because everyone's trying to just do their best in handling what they've all got there too. But if I go to a real kind of geospatial hat thing, and I think a problem that we sort of still have in the sort of world that I'm in, and if I think back into the early 2000s, I sort of got into that world of OGC and looking at open standards and kind of looking at these problems of having data still in formats that isn't easily transferred or isn't easily used, or all of these sorts of issues, and also duplicative data all the time. It's like so much money, time, and resources being spent all the time around the world generating data that is so often so similar or the same to other people around the place. So there's this, to me, that it always does my head in how much money gets spent on some projects. And I look across here and I'm like, so, but hang on a tick, like those guys over there have done almost exactly the same thing and we've spent like 3 times as much. You just kind of go, there's money being wasted all over the place. So I think there's still this issue of looking at each project we do, looking at each lot of data we're getting, and I think trying to work out, could it be reused? Can we make this available? How do I also make others aware of that? And how do I also go looking to see what's already available there too? So I think there's an element here around better use of standards. I think we still haven't cracked that. As great as the work is of OGC and W3C and ITU and all of these kind of technical standards bodies, I think there's still just so much work to try and improve the way those mechanisms work in how we do that data sharing. And I think in looking at the ethics work I'm doing, that's kind of related, because I think if we can get better at the open standards, hopefully that means we can also start developing those more automated transparency tools that go with that when we're doing that data sharing, so that we can more easily see what's happening. Whereas at the moment, with so many different formats, so many different proprietary ways of doing things, there's always black boxes. So you don't really know what's going on. So I think for me, that's still like a holy grail that we haven't quite made some cracks in the wall. I don't think we've actually quite smashed through that one yet.
Well, it has interesting implications also for maintaining, like, long-term maintenance of data and that sort of thing. I mean, I would suggest just abusing my position as moderator. I think it's because you have this sort of the degree to which, you're now kind of expected to publish a paper and include as much of the data as is not a privacy violation or is not commercially constrained or whatever other restrictions. I mean, and the degree to which those data formats and those processes, those are a necessary part of the way that you could recreate that, the science of recreating that and it being reproducible in any meaningful sense, in any human timeline. I think that's a really interesting point. And the fact that those standards are something which are still so much changing and not established and not something where everyone knows exactly how you're going to handle this. But so help you if you use, Panda, the wrong version of Pandas in processing this, because it's all going to be, disastrous. Oh, there's a null in that one line and now everything is on fire. Your whole chain doesn't work. So, Andrea makes fun of shapefiles in the chat.
Yeah, that was kind of why I laughed. I saw that come up immediately.
Yes, but Justine Blandford makes the point, nobody wants to pay for the maintenance of data, which I would like to underline my strong agreement with. And I think that's an interesting thing, especially from a university perspective. I mean, not all of us work for universities, but you know, and many of the people who are listening to this don't necessarily work for universities. But yeah, speaking from my perspective as an academic, the maintenance of things is not something that I would say has been prioritized by most organizations.
It's a really interesting tension, that one thing too. So if I go back further in my career, I did 12 years working for government in Australia, and I was part of the state government there at the time that they had open data sort of became this, you know, fantastic political slogan tool that everyone used at that time. And I think that there's been, I'm totally for a lot of open data. I think that's great, but I think maintenance becomes the really great challenge in the open data conversation, particularly when you talk about the government data. Because you have one, you know, political party over here that supported it, and they've kind of made all this stuff open. Then you have no guarantee that the next one that comes along is going to see the value in continuing to pay for that maintenance and making that continue happening. So I think there's a real, that maintenance question is always going to be a really great challenge to that open data side, particularly when you're talking about data that people build businesses on, or you know, rely on being maintained for the decisions or the processes that they do. That's a totally critical one.
Or address broad public health pandemics, like collecting that data, continuing to collect the data seems like it would be a really important aspect of addressing the larger public health problems. And to that extent, the open data is somewhat the solution to sort of a misinformation epidemic or the infodemic. In that giving people the tools to, well, you don't believe the numbers, here, go calculate it yourself. Go check, and making that accessible to anybody who's interested in doing it. That is the anecdote, but that isn't something that necessarily all governments are interested in.
Yeah, and that's the standards things. If you look across globally, there's just, and you look at the way the data's been collected for each country, even when you start looking at COVID, you know, I look at the lovely maps that have made of the world with sort of all the numbers. And I know that behind that, there is no consistency to the standards of how all of that data is being collected in each country. So actually, whilst I know from a data science perspective that I'm looking at that, you know, it looks all equal, I know that it's not, you know, and you have to kind of be aware enough, but not a lot of that is communicated out for people to understand that that's not the same standard-wise and what's coming underneath.
I mean, Licia, you tend to work at the boundaries between different disciplines, right? As a computational social scientist, it basically means you never get to be at home in any, I don't know if this is also your feeling, but you're always a little bit, you know, more technical than the social scientists and a little bit more interested in sort of, you know, but what is it for than the sort of Dago hackers. So how does that, you know, how does that communication process work for you? What are the challenges of that?
Well, I guess it was more difficult a few years ago when maybe we didn't even have the term computational social science. So academics, I didn't really have a home, and so when I was say mingling or submitting papers to the more algorithmic conferences, KDD, I was criticized for your algorithms are not complex enough. And then when I was dealing more with the social sciences conference, I was told, well, what are the implications of what you're doing? Why are you doing that, and so on. But now I have a feeling that, I mean, things have changed, and now we have a number of venues where I actually feel almost equal representation of the two. I have two conferences in mind. I don't know, Sarah, which one you have in your head, but at least in terms of conferences, I have CSCW, the Computer Supported Collaborative Conference, that I tend to feel like I'm part of that. And the other one, SWSM, the International Conference on Blogs and Social Media, which, thinking about what you were mentioning before about data collection and so on, maintenance, they, for the last few years, they have a track where you can just publish data sets. And the algorithms and code basically you are developing so that you can enable reproducible research. And I think that's the kind of initiatives that the confluence of the spatial and computational sciences have pushed for. So the data is out there for everyone to be analyzed. The techniques are there for everyone to reproduce exactly what different disciplines and different scientists were doing. I wish there were more. I mean, it's one conference. I don't know how many there are. I'm sure there are more I'm not aware of. But that's the kind of the good thing of different disciplines coming finally together in a more meaningful way other than just being the outlier in that conference. It does require effort. I mean, it does require investments in creating these venues.
Can I ask you to put those conference names in the chat for all of us? No. I mean, just for those of us who like, it's like you're like, wow, that great thing that like Licia mentioned and that I've immediately forgotten the name of.
We do.
Okay, great. Because that, I mean, I think that's like a brilliant idea, and the sort of, and that balancing of the maintenance, you know, like if you're getting credit for do you mind putting the full name rather than the acronym, just because?
I'm so bad at multitasking, so
oh no, I mean, well, I am rudely forcing you to both type and talk at the same time, which I always talk, or I always type whatever someone has said to me already. And actually, James has already put.
There. James, yes, he's been way faster.
Thank you, James. Okay, so I think there's time for maybe one more stupid question immediately before going into the Q&A session. This was my weirdest question, so I'm going to pose it. In the movie Pacific Rim, the movie Pacific Rim is basically about a bunch of Godzilla. Someone has immediately left the session and is like, I'm out. In the movie Pacific Rim, which is about a bunch of Godzilla-like creatures begin emerging from a rift in the Pacific Ocean. It's a great movie. But there's a scientist who studies these Godzilla-like creatures, which are the film's antagonists, and he has several of the different Godzilla creatures, which are called kaiju, if you're curious, tattooed on his arm. So my question was, how might you equivalently represent your field of study as a sleeve tattoo or two? How would you visually represent it in a compelling way? This is probably the hardest question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and as an agent-based modeler, the only thing I've really got so far, Nick Behrman says he would just put the word SHP.
Yeah. I was thinking probably some form of series of maps that are in a whole crazy set of different projections, like all of the kind of weirdness of the way people have looked at the world. Would be how I would go. Show that it's not just Wed Mercator. There are so many other. But I think just kind of it would represent kind of weird and wonderful ways we've looked at geography over the course of time. Like if you kind of had your sleeve studied all these different shapes and bits of the world over how everybody has shrunk it and squeezed it and stretched it and all of that in the different forms of mapping.
I really like that. Oh, that could be, yeah. Track it sort of like by year of that they were.
Yeah, that's it. It was a whole kind of chronology, and so hopefully some space for what someone comes up with next, kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I got. Yeah.
I'm sure somewhere. Sometime in the next 5 years, someone's going to come up to me at a conference and go, "Check out my tattoos." I was like on this call, and I was totally inspired.
It'll be amazing. I suggest that if anyone does that, they get free admittance to that GISRUK. You know, I'll spot your fee. You come back later, you're like, I got all different projection tattoos. Because Denise said too. Andrea agrees with me, so this is great. I think that is commitment to go halfsies, Andrea. Okay. Monica, Licia, any?
So I have never seen this movie, and of all the questions that you asked, all the other ones I was like, oh yeah, those are easy. Like I can talk about my least acceptable potato chip or crisp flavor. But this one, I was like, I study like the worst aspects of the internet, like the white supremacists, the false information, the shifts towards populism, how people lie. So I don't know, like the logos of all of the kind of populist electoral campaigns in the world. Like we could have Bolsonaro's logo, we could have Trump 2020's logo. You know, there's
and then like a little sad face emoji.
Look at the problems. What?
Like a little sad face emoji. Like,
yeah, or maybe just like some sad face emojis. Maybe the poop emoji.
I mean, Andrea has pointed out that that's actually very much in keeping with the original movie, because the whole point is they're terrible monsters, and he has tattoos on his arms, and the main character is horrified because they killed his brother, and he's like, "Why would you have this on your body? If you would like the incredible thought of this." Yeah. So, but honestly, that's a pretty good answer. Those are good monsters. Great answer.
Pretty awful.
Probably not a tattoo to. I would encourage any listeners not to get those tattoos. Please. But a great answer, and very much in keeping with the original spirit of the movie. Lucia, any thoughts?
Well, no, actually. When I reached that question, I was like, oh, surely in an hour panel we won't have time to cover everything up until then. I was like, yeah, no. I'll waste time on the others, but no, I really don't know. To be honest, in another sense, I haven't seen the movie. But you were mentioning the word antagonist, and so I thought, oh, I just said that I can't think of any antagonist in my field of research, so I don't want any of that tattoo. But no, to be honest, I'm not that an interesting person to be able to answer that question. Actually, I want your answer. You are the one.
We're like Stagfall. Yeah, well, I guess if it's the monsters, that's interesting, because if it's the monsters, I thought for a long time that like the sort of Jon Snow cholera map would be quite cool.
Oh, yeah.
I think it a little bit looked like a horrible disease, which is ironic because that's exactly what it's tracking. But it would sort of look like some kind of growth on your arm in quite a bad way. So that's probably it wouldn't be a good looking tattoo, to be sure. But yeah, I thought about it a lot. I thought about maybe like a sort of shelling segregation map where you could sort of see it, or like Herbert Simon's Parable of the Ant, but like that would be extremely obscure and literally no one would ever understand that. So I think that unfortunately Denise by far is better. Like it's the answer is Denise. Monica is tied for good answer, and then Lucia and I are just like yeah, I'm just looking for ideas, but computer science makes it hard. I mean, maybe like Java, just a huge.
Yeah, you could do like different languages through time as well. So like over the course of the history of computing, you could have it all change. So pick a phrase almost, and actually, or pick an expression, and then have it all in the different codes.
I mean, and that just means that for my intro to programming class, I'll just sort of like show my shoulder and be like.
Yeah, it's like the evolution of coding Python, or something.
JavaScript, Java, take them back to Fortran, and yeah, and oh, Stefano, no Haskell, not.
Yeah, not I knew that would open up a can of worms. That conversation.
I mean, that would be like it would be a good way to find one's own tribe, though, is to sort of oh no, okay.
What you can come up with.
Okay, I'm going to ignore these suggestions, although they are very good. So we said, I mean, I feel like I should also like throw back to Monica and Lucia. What was the potato chip that you were going to say was the worst and least acceptable potato chip? If you prepared an answer and you can just
pineapple. Like who eats pineapple potato chips?
Is that a thing?
Yeah, well, so
it's a potato that tastes like a pineapple?
Yeah. There's this chain of grocery stores called Grocery Outlet that sells like kind of factory extras of food. And yeah, they had the pineapple flavored crisps for months because nobody bought them.
That's terrorism. I don't approve. Okay, that's a great answer. And a horrible thing to exist. Licia, did you have a distinct potato chip flavor? I did write for the English people.
Okay.
I did write in the email because I am a professional working at a UK university.
So I'm Italian, and I claim to know a thing or two about food. And there are no such things as acceptable flavors in Greece. Full stop. No, I mean, no, this is a joke. I've been living in the UK for many years now. I didn't know that you could have flavors like vinegar or cheddar or anything in crisps or chips, or call it whatever you want. So there is nothing acceptable in that. Don't.
I mean, like, national differences count in this conversation, I think, because that
Absolutely.
seemed like a very traditional answer. So the Italians are showing up in the comment section.
Yeah, I see quite a few Italian names over here. I don't know what you guys think, but this flavored crisp thing is, yeah.
So moving swiftly along back to the more serious topics, Hannah has pulled out a couple questions which I think are really interesting. So, for example, I was wondering if I could ask you guys to talk about who decides what's reasonable in the data privacy space. Is it the researcher or the university? Is it the government? And Bruce, this question is coming from Bruce. They says legislation has big limitations with regard to the government's use of data, and they can do pretty much whatever they want. So, you know, what's reasonable?
Ooh, you know what? I'm going to take a really general answer to this, and I'm going to say everybody's responsible for this. So I think that, you know, to just suggest that there's one part of the equation that's responsible for how we responsibly use data and how we protect privacy. I think you as an individual, like, you got to just realize that the data being generated by the fact that you live on this planet now, if you interact with a computer, or if you've got a phone, or you've got a car that's got electronics in it, you have to realize that you are generating this data. So there is a level of kind of self-education, which I recognize not everyone has access to that, but there is a level of responsibility there. So that then shows that the education system that you live within as well has to have a responsibility to educate students and to educate their population to be able to do that as well. You then have got the legislative components, which of course you need a mechanism by which to smack people when they've done the wrong thing. Which is what legal systems are often very good at doing. But I think there is a real responsibility too for businesses. If you want to have a trusting relationship with customers, you have to have a responsibility in this equation as well for how you're transparent in doing those things. So I think, to me, that answer is that you can't just sort of push the responsibility for that to just one set of organizations. I think there is a sort of suite of responsibilities that you have to, and they need to collaborate with each other. I think is the other really challenging element of that, which we're not doing brilliantly on a lot of those aspects at the moment. But I think that it is important to sort of look at each of those different areas and work out the responsibilities of each and how they need to work together.
No, great. I mean, Monica, Licia, do you want to? I mean, that's such a.
I agree with that answer. Is that everybody has to, because if any one element fails, as long as there are backups, then privacy can be maintained.
Yeah, the thing I would, Denise was already hinting to that. There is a risk when we say that everybody is responsible, that nobody takes ownership.
Yeah.
So of the responsibility. So one would have to also specify everybody is responsible. What for? Let's define what the responsibilities of the different user groups are.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But one thing I've seen changing within academia, for example, is the amount of training we do to undergraduate students now on these topics, which wasn't even part of the curricula before. So I would suspect that as we go forward, we will anticipate the age at which we train individuals on data. So it will appear in schools and as early as possible, basically.
Yeah.
So it used to be the case that we were only training research students, on this. And now it's part of the undergraduate curricula and so on.
Yeah.
No, which is a change that I think all of us think is great. So Myra asks the question, with respect to using or not using certain data, what if you decide that the data needs to be used but will affect the privacy of users? Do you see the possibility of geomasking, location perturbation, techniques being adopted more with the rise in privacy awareness?
I think I need to go back and find that question.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. It's a good one, but there's quite a lot of parts to it. So,
I think the answer is yes. You know, even looking at some of the entrepreneurs that we've got working with us in Benchmark at the moment, we're looking at what techniques can you use when you know that privacy is going to be at risk. I think also sometimes there are quite legitimately good reasons for using personal data as well about people. And that goes back to something I said a lot earlier here as well. It's how you communicate that intent of what you're doing and how you're going to use that data with the person for whom there is affected by that. And also there's an element in there that perhaps I haven't raised today too, which is about giving that individual choice about whether to, leave that, enable you to collect that data or use that data in the way that you say you're going to. So I think to sort of say that you should never infringe privacy is just crazy, because I think there are many good reasons why you need very detailed personal data about, people in situations. Pandemics is a really good example.
I would say it depends both on what the actual data is and then also what the research question is that the data is trying to address. That there are times when masking privacy isn't going to work. It isn't going to address the question. It's going to cause more problems than it resolves and make the sort of research useless. There are other times where it's effective, but it's also quite effective to sometimes aggregate up, right? The researcher might have access to very hyperlocal personal information, but by aggregating the information with combining with others, they can turn out a result at a higher level, and still it's anonymized somewhat just by the aggregation elements of it. So it just really depends on what you're trying to do with it. I've been looking over the last couple of years at a lot of different sort of medical questions, going from the anti-vaccine movement of like, where are anti-vaxxers coming from? Where are they getting information from? How are they transmitting information? How is that impacting public policy at the local level? So if I don't know where they are, or I don't have the data, even the aggregate data of where the measles outbreaks have happened, it's really hard to kind of put this together and say, well, what has the impact of the way the information is coming into a region impacting the output of what the region is doing health-wise?
Yeah. If I may add, again, coming from my small narrow field and experience, it used to be the case that up until, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, whenever I was about to start a research project, do I have access to data? Can I scrape it? Can I crawl it? Whatever, and I was going for it. But now, things have started to be regulated, and so I have to go through an application through an ethics committee that will review what it is that I want to do. And part of this process has been great, because it has forced me and colleagues, academics, to think about the important questions that we should be asking ourselves before embarking. And if it is the case that the question we are asking is relevant, it's timely, it's important, and will require access to private information, then it's not like you can't do that research, but the committee and the regulators want to make sure that you are aware of the minimum amount of information you really need access to for the minimum amount of time, what techniques to protect the data so that it will not be possible for third parties to use and misuse and access. So it's not black or white, you can or you can't, but it's really forcing us researchers to think about really what it is that we need the data for, and how are we going to manage that.
Sort of a workplace safety approach, where you probably should think about what sort of...
But, Sarah, in more than one case, maybe it's from where I'm coming from, but in more than one case, I've realized that the first few times I was approaching this process is that I'll ask for everything, all the data for as long as I possibly can and so on, because the more the better. And then by going through this process over time, I've actually changed, and my mindset has changed, so to say, the minimum amount of information for the shortest period of time, so that I can answer the question. Well, there has been a point in time, well, even at the point of data collection, not just for us analyzing, but everyone said, let's record everything. You never know what you will be able to use it for. And then, these are abundance of data that people don't even know what to do with.
Yeah, well, that ties in a little bit with some of what you were saying about the more experimental approach, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's an interesting trend overall. So, okay, so I want to hit there's two more questions which I think are really interesting. And so basically, Stefano has pointed out, he says, going beyond data, what do you think about reproducible or open analysis and research? And that sort of almost does, well, is that at the opposite end of what we were previously talking about? Is that completely distinct from the sort of privacy concerns that we're talking about, or is that actually quite closely linked? Open analysis and research.
I think it kind of comes back to, you know, right tools, right data for the problem, if that makes sense. So I think, you know, all of these things, open data, reproducible, open analysis, research, you know, you simply can't make everything that, because you do have privacy implications and you do have issues related to these. So I think, you know, I think the same rules apply, if that makes sense, would be probably my response to that one. You know, I think it always goes back to, one of the things that I constantly say to people in the field that I'm working in at the moment is don't get caught up in the shiny tools. Just because you've got a very sparkly item you want to use, you can't retrofit that to everything. Just because you've got a great data set, you can't make it do everything you want it to do. You know, I think what we have to start doing is sort of thinking about the data and the tools first, which we're often, I find in the wonderful community I'm in, we do regularly because we love our tech. And focus, I think, a lot more on what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And then I think Licia's points are exactly right. You know, so what's the minimum data and what's the right tool that I need to use in order to be able to solve that problem, and think about it more, spend more time, I think, with the problem, and more time about, you know, what's the safest and best way to help try and address that. But I think I would actually say as well that I think that that's an encouraging shift that I'm seeing generally in a lot of areas. And I think there is sort of a movement away from just thinking about the technology all the time. We're spending a lot more time in this sort of social problems side of things, which is I think that's a really good shift.
Yeah. I have enjoyed that, but I mean, if either of the other two speakers want to actually say something. Just about reproducible or open research in general.
I mean, in terms of the computer science field, we have a trend of, or quite a lot of us, we are not only sharing data, we're also sharing code. So open source software is as big as, if not bigger than open source data. And so that's going in the right trajectory. Also because what we have found over time, and there is an encouragement again. So if you go to conference, because I have a foot in many different communities, so I also have been in the past at least strongly affiliated with the software engineering community, and there is where we basically, as a researcher, we produce tools. And it's part of the submission policies. When you want to contribute to these communities, you also have to release the software. So again, it enables the producibility. I mean, it's intrinsic in a sense. You can't. You need to open up your tools for others. And in fact, it's quite common. It has happened over the years that bugs have been discovered because actually new research students have started their research by taking whatever was the best tool for certain things and try it out and not being able to replicate the results. What was that about? And blah blah. And so on. So to me, open data, open software, and tools should really go hand in hand.
Yeah. I mean, Monica, does open analysis, I mean, you're having to work with some pretty, some data sets, and I'm not sure exactly how much, for some of them, obviously, they must be kept quite private. So, I mean, to what does open analysis, does the use of open source tools help you in that sense? I mean, because it doesn't have to just be the data, it can also be the processes of the.
Right, well, most of the data that I'm using comes from social media. So yes, Facebook has ridiculous restrictions on any data that I do get from them, but most of the time when it's Twitter data, which is easy, it's accessible, anybody else could have harvested it too. It's just kind of a question of like, were you harvesting it at that time? You know, it's not like it's even that unique of a data set. Yes, the only issue is that sometimes it is people's personal data, and I think it would be frowned upon if I did suddenly release it publicly. But you know, it's I don't think of it as super private because it was put out there. And then with some of the Facebook data recently that I've been just pulling and I haven't really done anything with yet is the sort of discourse in the U.S. of people planning on their reopen the economy protests. And so I have a lot of this data where I'm just like, I don't think these are real people. I don't think they're actually there. Like, I don't believe it. But also, they didn't make their data private. So why really should I be protecting it at a higher level than they are? And I also don't believe they are people. Like, I think that these are likely Russian agents. They're not citizens actually saying, like, I believe we need to storm the Capitol. I think that these are provocateurs abroad. And so I don't really feel that strongly about it, that I need to beyond, like, kind of standard research protocols.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, that's an especially interesting thing, too, because if it's the sort of thing where you're attempting to study one thing and I mean, if you were a biologist trying to study, like, one thing and it turned out that you had actually discovered a horrifying disease, you should probably publish on the horrifying disease because that's not what you were originally trying to study.
Right.
Or the rest of us would sure appreciate it.
But I mean, I agree with, you know, what everyone else has said on that respect. Like, and also I really do appreciate the people who do put their code up on GitHub, especially. Like, I use a lot of it. Thank you. A lot of special thanks are owed to people who have shared their code libraries with me. So.
Yeah. I mean, me too. I am also very grateful to all of you. So final question, do you have any suggestions or tips for some of the younger people who are joining the geospatial sector right now? And
I liked that you had this question in there, and you had asked about like what we did early in our careers as well. Yeah. And I thought this was a really great question, is the one thing that I felt was really helpful that I did kind of as an early career researcher was I joined the Floating Sheep blog, and I blogged with colleagues about what results and what things we were thinking about, and what current events, and kind of connected the geospatial to whatever was happening in the news media. By putting my research out there, by putting like just thoughts or like unformed papers, it's not enough to even be really research. You're not really studying penis size or whatever. You're just kind of pulling the data together and making maps and having it be fun. It meant that often I could sometimes take bits of things that I had done and develop them further. Or it meant that other people could reuse that, but it was the most helpful thing that I did as an early career scholar to kind of help kind of lay the scaffolding to build a career on that, and to kind of build up a network to share it. And then I still get like random text messages from people that, oh, your maps were being shown in my methods class. And as much as putting all my stuff out there, or putting maps out there on the internet, I did get a lot of people criticizing them or like publicly trying to shame me for like mistakes that I made with that. I learned a huge amount by doing that and by making it accessible. But I also made it so that a lot of people could use it, and got a lot of media attention based on that, just by being like, hey, here's some cool maps, but I think this is interesting. How many people are talking about twerking versus the war in Syria? You know, let's measure these random variables and think about how society divides spatially. And I really encourage anyone else, like, start a blog and make maps and do what you think is interesting, put it out there, and you'll sort of find a community around that.
So the original question I sent the panelists was, I said, what was the best decision you made when you were an early career researcher? And it's, you know, which is quite a stressful.
Sorry.
No. I mean, that's what I'm saying is I realize that's quite a big question because, you know, and it's the benefit of hindsight, of course. But I mean, that is, like what Monica has just said, is something that my supervisor said a million times. Andrew Crooks, who's the one who's sorry to not be meeting you, if you're curious. It's documented forever in the recording. But yeah, so that sort of online presence was a huge aspect of, you know, a lot of people who I like and respect's work. Nick is in this thread saying that he would recommend The Conversation as well, which is a great resource for publishing this type of work. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people at this conference are really, really good at that. I am rubbish, so.
Have a website. Just whatever you're doing, you're thinking about, put it on your website. Whatever, like, is irking you at 10 p.m., put it on your web, like, make a map, put it online, share it.
You should listen to Monica on this. I'll back her up. Do as she says, not as I do. But okay, Licia, you've come up. What are your thoughts? What was the best career move as an early career researcher?
Now, this answer will probably show my age. When I started as a junior academic, the first thing I did was not to follow career advice, actually. And the career advice I got back then was to maintain deep, narrow, focused research in a field and establish myself as the leading expert in X plus minus delta. And that would have been the best way, you know, to lead to professorship. And I think it was wrong advice. It just was not suitable for me. And actually the most exciting research and the best way for me to develop as an academic has been, as you were mentioning before, by joining dots in very different fields, which I've been spanning from social science to geography to computer science, my core, I guess, urban planning and so on. And it has required a lot of twists and turns, which most of the time have not been made consciously, but opportunistically. And it has taken 15 years for finally finding a place that I can call home in the academic community, which is an interdisciplinary field. That's why I'm saying it will probably show my age, because now interdisciplinary research is no big deal, in a sense. Yeah, so basically recognize that advice is appreciated, but there are times where you may actually want not to follow, like if it doesn't feel like it is right for you or appropriate for you.
Denise, can I put you on the spot too?
You can, and this is probably one of those good moments where I declare a couple of other hats that I wear in the industry as well. So one of them is that I sit on the steering committee of a thing called the Women in Geospatial Network, which is only been around for a couple of years now, and is very much about supporting, I guess, diversity across the geospatial community globally. So one of the things that I would absolutely say to everybody is, if you've got any interest in being a speaker in your space, get in and register yourself as a speaker on the database there. So it's one of the sort of big things. And I think, so that's one hat I wear. The other hat I wear is that I'm chair of the AGI here in the UK, so the Association for Geographic Information. And so one of the things that I'd say to anybody in the early stage of their career, if they're an academic, if they're just keen on getting in the commercial space, if they're just wanting to get launching in their career, networking is the absolute best way, not just to further your career, but broaden your horizons as to what the different options are that are there. There is absolutely no way anyone could have possibly described to me the sort of job that I am doing now when I was in my 21 years of age and said, this is what you're going to be doing 2 decades from now, I would have been like, what even is that? And so I think that the best piece of, I guess, advice to give people is to just always keep your eyes open, always keep your mind open as to what your career could actually be. So, and, if you're really interested to know more about that sort of thing, I'll plug and say that there was a couple of panels that we've just done with women in geospatial that would generally, and also the AGI's early career network, that are specifically looking at what a geospatial career is, and kind of what those different elements are. So if you're interested in that, I know the videos are up and around the place. So by all means, find me on Twitter. I'm Spatial Red on Twitter, one of the strangest Twitter handles. Around the place, but ping me on that and I will happily share links and so forth for all those things. But if I look back across the course of my career, anything I would have said was a bad decision. I saw that there, like, what would you have done differently? I'm like, I can always think about something differently. I think every single decision I've made, I've learned something from, and I think that's the key to your career, is kind of being open enough to try something different and then go, it didn't work quite the way I expected, but what did I learn from that and how did I grow from that, would be kind of the way I look back on all of those decisions. But yeah, I mean, I've jumped to so many different government, NGOs, private sector, like it's been a bit all over the place.
Well, it sounds like you're an empiricist. You could confirm whether you actually liked it or not, and a true scientist.
Yeah, I think that's
what you both said in that. I just wanted to say, like, the one mistake that I made, just like what you were saying, was that I decided too early which path I wanted to go down to be that little tiny specialist. And I really wish I had considered sort of the very much broader options and kind of embraced or pursued sort of interdisciplinary, non-traditional GIS way earlier. Like, I really wish I had considered, like, maybe go into political science for a semester or sociology or anything else for like a small amount of time and collaborate or build those connections in a field that's totally different or something. Like do multiple things.
I totally and utterly agree with you, Monica. And I think actually for anybody who has got geospatial skills at the moment, this is such a phenomenally exciting time. And what I would say is a gentle challenge to you all, don't just look for a traditional pathway. Like, there are now so many fields and so many disciplines that really are waking up to how they could be using that geospatial skill in what they're doing. Reach out and try some of those. So don't just look for GIS in the job description. Maybe look for like data scientists. Maybe look for some of these other data analysis type things. I think you'll find that the skills actually apply quite consistently, and it's really interesting to see some of the research coming out that the Geospatial Commission are doing here in the UK at the moment, looking at that, how skills are described in the geospatial space and how that's changing at the moment. So I think there'll be some really worthwhile research to have a look at the other side of that, to sort of look for the terms you might look for jobs.
And often the company, if it's a private industry or nonprofit, they don't actually know they need a GIS or a data science specialist. They just know they have a problem. And you might have the skills that you're like, well, if we took that data and this data and made a map, smush, we'd made something really neat. And pursue that aspect where they're not going to say they don't even know they need a map. They don't even know they need a GIS analysis. They don't even know what they need. But you can be the expert on that by doing that. And I think like there's a lot of avenues in also it doesn't have to necessarily be industry. You can do it in community organizing. You can do it in nonprofit sector. You can do it in a lot of different spaces.
Government needs this.
Government and government doesn't always know that GIS is the answer. And maybe GIS isn't the answer. Like, be open to other forms of analysis, like social network analysis or various different ways of putting information together.
Justine Blandford suggests that we should also have fun along the way, which is a good suggestion.
I am totally
Fun for those listening is when you are doing something you enjoy and not work. So it might be good for everyone to go transition to that at this point, because we are at the end of our time. I want to say thank you so much to our brilliant panelists. Denise, Licia, Monica, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us and sort of talk about your expertise and talk about your experiences. I super appreciate it. And thank you also, I just want to say in the background to Nilüfer, who is moderating this and has been keeping us safe from any dreadful chat comments, and I haven't seen any, so she's done a bang-up job. And thank you to Hannah Gumbel, who is also been feeding me these good questions from the audience. Thank you, the audience, for your brilliant questions, and also for your terrible suggestions regarding programming languages that I will not tell you in the audience. And thank you guys all so much. At some point in the not too distant future, I hope that we can all co-locate and have lunch to celebrate this.
That would be fantastic.
That would be great. You've been a great host, so thanks a lot for organizing the panel.
and thank you for such thoughtful questions. I'm really looking forward to your worst band as well.
I made you answer the Pacific Rim question live, and that's because I'm a monster. Oh. The real monster was me all along.
Thank you so much for all of this. This is really lovely. And thank you to Andrea and others for putting this together as well.
Yeah, well done, everybody. Really, really good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.